Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Midnight Theater, a place where restless spirits linger long after the final curtain falls, where old ghosts awaken, forgotten legends return, and every darkened doorway may hide a story of its own. The hour is late, the shadows are long, so turn down the lights, draw the curtains, and listen closely, because tonight's stories are about to begin. Alone in the Dark. The rain had already settled in for the night by the time they arrived at the Velvet Cinder Room. It did not fall in a steady rhythm, but rather in uneven pulses against the tall, narrow windows, as though something unseen tested the glass from the outside. Beyond it, the street had long since dissolved into fog. The gas lamps lining the pavement were reduced to dim, uncertain halos, their light struggling to reach the ground beneath them. The world outside felt distant, almost unreal. Inside, however, the warmth lingered. Not the comforting warmth of a lively gathering, but something heavier. Something that clung to the walls and the furniture as though it had remained there for far too long without interruption. The dark wood panels, the high-backed chairs, the antique mirrors, everything bore the quiet weight of time. Benedict Shaw noticed the silence before he understood it. It came not with absence, but with contrast. Only moments earlier there had been laughter, careful, measured, but genuine enough. Glasses had been raised, names exchanged, old memories stirred cautiously back to life. Yet now that fragile ease had withdrawn, leaving behind something far more familiar. A pause, a space no one wished to fill. It had begun with a name. Jeremy. No one had meant to say it, and yet, once spoken, it seemed to settle into the room as though it had been waiting for the moment. Clara White lowered her eyes immediately, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. Rupert Sinclair leaned back in his chair with a faint exhale, his expression composed but distant. Daniel Graves did not move at all, though something in his posture had changed, subtle but unmistakable. Benedict observed them quietly. 20 years had passed, and still nothing about that name had softened. "It's strange," Clara said at last, her voice quiet but steady, "how we can sit here as if nothing ever happened." Rupert allowed himself a small, restrained smile, though it carried no warmth. "Because nothing did happen, Clara. At least, nothing that wasn't already explained." She looked up at him then, and there was something in her expression that caused even Benedict to shift slightly in his seat. "Explained?" she repeated. The word lingered between them. "Jeremy went into that house alone," Rupert continued, his tone measured, almost rehearsed. "At night. In weather not unlike this. He was found days later. The conclusion was clear." "It was wrong," Clara said. There was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty. Benedict felt the tension in the room tighten, as though the very air had drawn inward. "They said it was suicide," she went on, more quietly now, but no less firmly. "But you saw him. We all did. That wasn't someone who chose to die." Benedict closed his eyes briefly. He had not allowed himself to remember that night in detail. Not for a very long time. But now it returned. Not as fragments, but as something whole. Jeremy's body laid unnaturally still. The strange stillness of the room in which he had been found. And above all, the expression. Not sorrow, not resignation, but terror. I remember. Clara nodded, though she did not look at him. There was no weapon, she continued, on no sign of how it happened, and the room was sealed, Benedict finished. Rupert said nothing this time. It was Daniel who spoke next, his voice low, as though he feared it might carry further than intended. People talk about that place. Rupert's jaw tightened slightly. People always do. Daniel hesitated, then continued. They say the walls aren't empty, that you can hear them, if you listen long enough. Voices, not echoes, not imagination, voices. The rain struck harder against the windows. Clara's gaze drifted toward the glass. And the woman, she said quietly. Rupert gave a faint, dismissive breath, but did not interrupt. They say she walks the house at night, Clara continued, with a lantern, that she finds those who lose their way in the dark and guides them. A brief silence followed. The room seemed to draw colder. Benedict felt it then, not in the air, but somewhere deeper. A memory, not of sight nor of sound, but of feeling. That same quiet dread they had all shared once before, standing at the edge of those woods, staring at a house that did not welcome them, yet did not turn them away. I've heard him, Clara said suddenly. The words pulled them all back. In my dreams, she went on, her voice trembling now despite her effort to steady it. Not far away, not distant, close, as though he were just beyond reach. Benedict said nothing. Rupert did not argue. They followed her through corridors that seemed longer than memory allowed, past doorways that opened into darkness so complete it felt deliberate. The lantern's light guided them, yet never revealing more than it chose. The air grew colder as they climbed, heavier. The walls, once silent, seemed to wait. Then a sound behind them. Benedict turned. Rupert was gone. Rupert! He called. No answer. Clara's voice trembled. He was right there. The voices returned, not softly this time, not distant. They surged, loud, desperate. Stay with us. Don't leave. A scream tore through the corridor. Rupert. It echoed once, twice, then stopped. Abruptly, silence followed. Then slowly, a new voice joined the others. His. Clara shook her head. No! The lantern flickered. The woman had stopped. She waited before a narrow doorway. Clara stepped forward. He's here, she said. Benedict followed. The room beyond was bare. Stone walls, no windows, no escape. The voices pressed in around them now, no longer distant, but immediate, layered, overlapping, desperate beyond measure. Don't follow her! A voice said. Jeremy! Clara turned. The lantern flared. The woman moved, not slowly this time, not gently. She crossed the space between them in an instant, her face turned toward them, and for the first time they saw it. Pale, hollow, not twisted with rage, but emptied of something essential. Her eyes held no life, only need. The walls shifted, hands pressed outward from the stone, shapes forming where none should exist, fingers stretched, reaching, grasping. Clara cried out as something seized her wrist. Benedict! He lunged forward, but the floor seemed to move beneath him. The room tilted. The voices rose to a deafening roar. Clara was pulled back, into the wall, not through it, into it, her body sinking as though the stone itself had given way. Her scream echoed, then vanished. The lantern dimmed, the walls stilled, and the room fell silent. Benedict ran. He did not remember how, only that he moved through corridors that twisted, down staircases that should not have led where they did, guided only by instinct and something deeper than reason. Until the door. He forced it open. The storm struck him at once. Rain, wind, cold, real and overwhelming. He stumbled forward, collapsing into the mud, his breath tearing from him in uneven gasps. Behind him, the door moved slowly, quietly. They returned days later, with men, with light, with certainty. They found nothing. No Clara, no Rupert, no trace of anyone who had entered. Only dust, silence, nothing. As they prepared to leave, Benedict turned once more toward the staircase. For a moment, only darkness. Then, a flicker, a lantern, and beside it, two figures, still, watching, waiting. Some say the house is empty, others know better, for on nights when the rain falls without rhythm and the fog settles low among the trees, there are those who hear voices in the walls and see a lantern moving slowly through the dark. Never alone.
When midnight strikes. High above the valley, where the hills rose into dark stone ridges and the wind whispered through long grass, stood Dunraven Castle. No smoke had risen from its chimneys for generations, no banners flew from its towers, yet the castle was not entirely silent. Those who lived in the scattered cottages below often spoke, in lowered voices, of the old clock in the castle's great hall. The clock, they said, had never stopped. It still marked the hours faithfully. And on certain nights, when the moon was full and pale above the hills, the clock was said to strike midnight. But sometimes, when midnight came, the clock struck 13 times. Those who claimed to have heard the 13th chime always said the same thing afterward. The dead were not resting inside Dunraven Castle. They were waiting. Henry Blackwell arrived in the village just before nightfall. He had spent years studying the forgotten histories of old houses and abandoned castles, collecting fragments of folklore that scholars often dismissed too easily. Blackwell believed that legends, even the strangest ones, were rarely born from nothing. Somewhere inside every old tale lay a truth, and the story of Dunraven Castle had drawn his attention the moment he first encountered it in a dusty archive. An unexplained execution, 13 prisoners, a clock that struck 13 times. Too many records contradicted one another, yet the same details returned again and again, like a stubborn echo through time. So Henry Blackwell had come to see the castle for himself, and tonight the moon was full. At the edge of the village stood a low, ancient building crouched beside the road. Its sign creaked softly in the wind, Ravenhurst Inn. Warm light spilled through the windows, and the smell of smoke and old wood drifted into the cool evening air. Blackwell stepped inside. The tavern felt older than the village itself. Thick oak beams crossed the ceiling, darkened by generations of smoke. Candles flickered along the walls, their flames bending gently in the slow currents of air. In the hearth, a low peat fire glowed with a steady warmth. A handful of villagers sat quietly at rough wooden tables. Behind the bar stood a tall, thin man with greying hair and watchful eyes. This was Walter Langley, the inn's caretaker. Blackwell ordered a drink and, after a few polite exchanges, casually mentioned the castle above the hill. The effect was immediate. The quiet murmur of the room faded. Walter Langley regarded him carefully. "You've an interest in the old place, do you?" he said at last. "I study local history," Blackwell replied, "and Dunraven Castle seems to possess a rather unusual legend." Walter poured the drink slowly before answering. "Most folk around here don't care to speak of it much. But you know the story." Walter gave a faint nod. I know it well enough." He leaned one hand on the bar and looked toward the window, where the distant outline of the castle's towers could just be seen against the rising moon. "Centuries ago," Walter began quietly, "Dunraven Castle belonged to Lord Malcolm Dunraven, a powerful man, but not a stable one, toward the end of his days." Blackwell listened attentively. "They say Lord Dunraven became convinced that enemies had crept into his household," Walter continued. "Spies, traitors, conspirators hiding among his own people." "And he found 13 of them?" Blackwell asked. Walter's expression darkened. He claimed he did. The fire cracked softly in the hearth. 13 prisoners were brought before him in the great hall. Servants, guards, merchants passing through the valley. No trial worth speaking of, just accusations and anger. Walter lowered his voice slightly. "The executions were ordered for midnight." Blackwell felt the faintest chill run through him. "And the clock?" he asked. Walter nodded slowly. "Aye, the clock." He glanced again toward the dark hill outside. "When the moment came, the clock struck midnight, but the men carrying out the sentence swore afterward that it did not strike 12. Walter's voice grew softer. "They said the clock struck 13 times. Blackwell leaned forward. "And the prisoners?" Walter looked at him steadily. "They were executed all the same." A long moment passed. Blackwell finally asked a question that had been waiting in the silence. "And the ghosts?" Walter did not answer immediately. Instead, he said quietly, "They say the prisoners never truly left that hall." Blackwell gave a faint smile. "And yet people claim to see them." Walter nodded once. 12 of them." Blackwell frowned. 12. Walter's gaze remained fixed on him. "Aye." He paused before finishing the sentence. "Because there were 13 prisoners once, but now there are only 12 ghosts." Blackwell raised an eyebrow. "And why is that?" Walter leaned a little closer across the bar. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Because every so often, the castle finds another." Blackwell left the Ravenhurst Inn not long afterward. The moon had climbed higher now, shining pale and cold above the valley. The path leading up the hill wound through tall grass that whispered softly against the stones. Dunraven Castle loomed above him. Its towers were jagged shapes against the sky, and its walls seemed to swallow the moonlight rather than reflect it. The great doors stood half open. Blackwell stepped inside. The castle smelled of stone and age. His footsteps echoed faintly as he walked deeper into the structure until at last he reached the great hall. The room was immense. Tall windows arched along the far wall, allowing pale moonlight to spill across the ancient floor. Torn banners hung motionless in the shadows. At one end of the hall stood a wide stone fireplace where embers glowed faintly beneath a crust of ash, and beside the fireplace stood the clock. A massive grandfather clock carved from dark wood. It was still running. The slow, steady ticking echoed softly through the empty hall. Blackwell approached it. The hands pointed to 11:48 p.m. He glanced towards the fireplace, brushed aside some ash, and stirred the embers until a small flame rose once more. Then he waited. The castle grew quieter as the minutes passed, yet the silence felt unnatural. Somewhere far above, a door creaked. From a distant corridor came the faint sound of something dragging slowly across stone. Blackwell told himself it was merely the wind moving through broken passages. Still, the air in the hall seemed to grow colder. The ticking of the clock grew louder. Each second landed like a drop of water in a cavern. Tick, tick, tick. Then the clock began to move. The great mechanism stirred with a deep, hollow sound. The first chime rang through the hall. 1. The sound echoed against the stone walls. 2. Blackwell remained seated near the fire, though his pulse had begun to quicken. 3. The shadows along the walls seemed to deepen. 4. The air felt colder now. 5. Something shifted in the far corner of the hall. 6. A shape appeared where no shape had stood before. Blackwell leaned forward. 7. Another figure emerged beside the first. 8. More shapes formed along the walls. 9. They were unmistakable now. Men, standing silently in the moonlight. 10. Their faces were pale and still. 11. Their clothing hung in tattered folds like garments worn centuries ago. 12. 12 figures stood in a wide circle across the hall. They simply waited. The final chime faded into silence. The clock groaned. A deep, metallic sound rolled through the hall. The mechanism moved again, and then it happened. The clock struck once more. 13. The sound seemed to freeze the air itself. Slowly, very slowly, all 12 figures turned their heads toward Henry Blackwell. For the first time, their hollow eyes met his. And then they began to move, not quickly, not violently, but with the calm certainty of something that had waited a very long time. One of the spirits stepped forward. As it did, its pale form began to fade. The truth struck Blackwell with sudden clarity. There had once been 13 prisoners, but now there were only 12 ghosts. One place must always remain empty, until someone new arrived. The fading spirit disappeared entirely. Cold hands closed around Blackwell's shoulders. The fire in the hearth flickered violently, and then the hall fell silent once more. Morning came slowly to the valley. From the cottages below, the villagers saw a thin ribbon of smoke rising once again from the chimney of Dunraven Castle. Inside the great hall, the fire burned softly. The grandfather clock ticked with steady patience. Its hands rested once again at 11:48 p.m., and standing in the long shadows of the hall were 13 silent figures, watching, waiting. Because sooner or later someone always comes to investigate Dunraven Castle. And when midnight strikes, the castle remembers.
The Ghost Train. Long before the forests reclaimed the valley, a railroad once cut straight through it like a scar of iron. The line ran between dark hills and across a wide basin where fog gathered easily at night.
In those days, trains passed through regularly. Freight engines hauling timber and coal, passenger cars filled with travelers moving between distant towns. People remembered the sound of those trains more than anything else. The steady thunder of wheels across the valley, the slow hiss of steam drifting over the trees, and the whistle. It could be heard miles away on clear nights, echoing along the slopes like the cry of some enormous mechanical bird. But that was many years ago. The railway was abandoned after a terrible accident late one autumn night, and the small town that once depended on it slowly withdrew into the quiet routine of farms, logging camps, and lonely mountain roads. The depot rotted, the rails rusted, and the forest returned. The town was called Raven Creek. It was not large enough to appear on most maps anymore, but travelers occasionally passed through on their way to other places. The road wound between scattered farmhouses and low hills before disappearing into long stretches of pine forest. Those who lived there rarely spoke about the railroad, yet everyone in Raven Creek knew where the old tracks lay hidden beneath the trees, and most of them avoided that part of the valley after dark. Edward Mallory arrived in Raven Creek on a cold autumn afternoon. He had come on business involving the estate of a distant relative who had owned a small piece of property near the valley. The matter required several signatures and discussions with a local lawyer whose office was little more than a narrow room above the town's general store. The work took longer than Edward expected. By the time the documents were completed, evening shadows had already stretched across the valley floor. Edward had planned to leave town on the evening stagecoach, but a damaged wheel on the road delayed the driver long enough that the coach departed without him. The innkeeper offered him a room for the night. Edward declined. He disliked wasting time in unfamiliar places, and he had been told that another small settlement lay only a few miles beyond the valley. If he walked along the county road, he could reach it before midnight, so he took his lantern and valise and set out alone. At first, the road was clear, fields spread out on both sides, broken occasionally by split-rail fences and small barns leaning in the wind. The last light of day faded behind the hills, and a pale moon rose slowly above the distant trees. But as Edward walked deeper into the valley, a fog began to form along the ground. It drifted upward from the low marshlands and crept across the fields until the road ahead blurred into a pale gray ribbon. After half an hour, the road reached a fork. One path curved upward into a thick stand of pine trees. The other dipped between two overgrown embankments. Edward hesitated only briefly before choosing the lower road. He walked another 10 minutes before he saw the rusted iron gate. Beyond it lay a narrow cutting through the hillside, and at the bottom of that cutting ran the remains of a railroad track. The rails were nearly hidden beneath moss and fallen leaves. Old wooden ties had cracked and shifted apart. The entire line looked as though it had not been used in decades. To Edward's right stood the remains of a small depot platform. The building itself had long since collapsed, but a narrow shack still stood beside the tracks, and faint light flickered inside its single window. Edward approached the shack and knocked on the door. After several moments, it opened. The man who stood inside was extremely old. His shoulders were bent, his beard white and uneven, and his eyes seemed far too sharp for someone of such advanced age. He held the lantern in one hand and studied Edward carefully before speaking. "You're not from around here," the old man said. "No," Edward replied politely. "I'm afraid I may have taken the wrong road. I was looking for the route to Millstone Crossing." The old man nodded slowly. "You passed it." Edward sighed. "I suspected as much." The man's gaze shifted toward the rails behind him. "You shouldn't be near these tracks tonight," he said quietly. Edward glanced over his shoulder at the rusted line. "Why not?" The old man hesitated. "Because if you hear a whistle," he said at last, "you must not look toward the tracks." Edward allowed himself a faint smile. "That sounds like a ghost story." The old man did not smile. "My name is Calder," he said. Edward nodded. "Mallory." Calder studied him a moment longer before pointing toward the gate. "If you leave now and take the road through the pine grove, you'll find your way back to the main road." That was when the rails began to hum. A thin vibration beneath Edward's boots. Then the iron trembled more strongly. Edward frowned. "What is that?" Calder's expression changed instantly. "Go," he said. Then the whistle came. It echoed through the fog-covered valley like the cry of something enormous and wounded. Edward froze. Far down the tracks, a dim yellow light appeared in the mist. Another light followed beneath it. Then another. The lights grew larger, and slowly the locomotive emerged from the fog. It was an old steam engine, black, heavy, and gleaming with damp. Smoke poured from its chimney and drifted low across the ground. On the front of the engine, a pale metal plate bore the unmistakable shape of a skull. Behind the locomotive came 3 passenger cars. Their windows glowed faintly with yellow light. The train rolled slowly toward the platform and stopped. One of the carriage doors creaked open. Inside sat passengers. They wore clothing from another era, dark coats, long dresses, stiff collars. But something about them was terribly wrong. They did not move naturally. They did not breathe. The woman nearest the door turned her face toward Edward. Her skin was pale beneath streaks of soot. "You're late," she said softly. Edward stepped backward. Then every passenger turned toward him at once. Their faces were broken, burned, blood-stained. A child held a torn ticket in small, blackened fingers and smiled. Before Edward could run, the conductor stepped down from the train. He was tall and thin, dressed in a long railway coat and cap. His face was colorless and his eyes looked dull and empty. "Ticket, please," the conductor said calmly. "I don't have one," Edward stammered. The conductor tilted his head slightly. "That's all right," he said. "You've been expected." He seized Edward's arm and pulled him onto the train. The door slammed shut. The whistle sounded again, and the train began to move. Inside the carriage, the passengers sat motionless while the valley slid past the windows. Then Edward looked outside. The landscape had changed. Lanterns flickered along the track. Men shouted in alarm. Smoke rose from twisted iron and broken timber. Another locomotive raced toward them through the fog. Edward understood. He was watching the night of the disaster. The moment when 2 trains collided on the same track. The passengers turned toward him. "Now you will remember with us," the woman said. The collision came like thunder. Wood shattered, metal screamed, flames burst into the night sky, and Edward Mallory died among them in the wreckage of a disaster that had happened more than 40 years before. The next morning, Calder returned to the abandoned depot. The fog still clung to the valley. The tracks lay silent beneath the trees. There was no sign that a train had passed during the night, but near the platform he found two things: a shattered lantern and a gentleman's hat. Years passed. The forest continued to swallow the railroad, and the old depot slowly collapsed beneath wind and rain. Travelers rarely came through Raven Creek anymore, but the farms remained scattered across the valley, and the people who lived there knew the forest better than anyone else. They knew how sound traveled through the hills when the fog settled low among the trees, and they knew that sometimes, on cold autumn nights when the moon hung pale above the valley, something still moved along the forgotten railway. No one went to the tracks after sunset. No one stood beside the old platform anymore. But every now and then, someone would wake in the middle of the night and listen carefully, because from somewhere deep in the forest, beyond the reach of lantern light or road or town, there sometimes came the long, hollow cry of a steam whistle. And once in a while, you can still hear it blowing through the fog.
And so, ladies and gentlemen, we reach the end of tonight's visit to the Midnight Theater. A place where restless echoes linger long after the final curtain falls, and where even silence seems to remember what was said. Where the shadows slowly settle back into their corners, reluctantly letting go of the stories they've been holding. Now, the hour is even later. The darkness a little softer, and somewhere beyond the fading candlelight, whatever was listening may still be there, just not quite as close as before. So, extinguish the candles, pull back the curtains, and step carefully back into the world you came from. Until we meet again at the Midnight Theater. Good night.